My paper is titled Composing in Groups, Individual Expressions and Collective Output in Early 20th Century Japan. I would like to offer some reflections on the development of modernist art in Japan through the lens of group dynamics. The years I considered here, the early 20th century, were basically contemporaneous with the years of the Blue Rider and Expressionism in Germany. By 1910, in major cities of Japan, latest artistic trends in Europe were being introduced more or less real-time through journalism, publications, photographic reproductions, sometimes actual works, and mediated by a network of cosmopolitan Japanese artists and intellectuals. For instance, Kandinsky's publications such as these were circulating. Hal Foster has written in Art Since 1900 that for the Blue Rider artists, in quote, the isolation of human beings was a problem to overcome, not a condition to deepen. And they proposed an aesthetic of abstraction as empathy with nature and or spirit, in seeking an equation of feeling and form, a reconciliation between inner necessity and outer world, end quote. This integrating pursuit of the Blue Rider Expressionism struck a particularly sympathetic resonance with progressive Japanese artists and intellectuals in the early 20th century. More so than the analytical constructivism of Cubism, or Futurism's fascination with machines and speed, or with a strand of Expressionism that explored the alienation of urban experience. In March 1914, 70 woodblock prints by Kandinsky, Franz Marc, Max Pechstein, Oskar Kokoschka, and other expressionist and futurist artists who were associated with the Berlin-based art and literary journal Der Strom were exhibited in Tokyo. These are a few prints shown at the exhibit that remained in Japan. This exhibition was organized by the composer Yamada Kosaku and the designer Saito Kazuo, who brought the prints from Berlin. This was a landmark event where many original works by contemporary avant-garde European artists were shown for the first time in Japan. The reception was mixed, however. The cultural moment in early 20th century Japan is characterized as an age when young writers and artists were seeking to establish the modern concept of the self, and to live as a distinctive individual and express the singularity of life as one's work. By the 1910s, Japan had transformed itself into a modern constitutional monarchy, in fact a regional empire, by having colonized Taiwan and Korea, as well as Okinawa to the south and Hokkaido to the north. The 1902 Anglo-Japanese alliance moreover acknowledged Japan's military power in the region, a position then reinforced by Japan's victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. Domestically, public education and other administrative infrastructure were building a society that sought to equalize regional and educational differences to an extent. Although the formation of public opinions via journalism also worked to call attention to economic and class disparities. The intellectual class, to which most of the artists who I'll be discussing belonged, was also beginning to voice more clearly and publicly the differences between their own interests and worldview, and those that were officially prescribed by the state. In art, we are looking at a situation where artists were collectively investigating the self-concept. Here, you can see that these four artists were positioning their artistic self-identity by stylizing their likeness in a manner derived from European art, such as Impressionism, Van Gogh, Fauvism, or Expressionism, which these three painters on the left knew largely through reproductions. And El Greco more directly in the case of Umehara on the right, who painted this self-portrait while he was studying in Paris. These artists were also representative artists of their age, known for their active participation in various art groups. One might say that the situation presented an ostensible paradox of the rise of individual self-expression in the age of groups, or the rise of groups in the age of individual expression. In other words, why form groups to assert the self? In my opinion, group formation was actually a necessary condition for a heightened awareness of the self-concept to emerge and its nuanced delineation to become communicable as cultural form. In social identity theory, developed by psychologists such as Henry Teifel, it is proposed that, in quote, we construct a self-concept that reflects the society we live in, end quote. The process of social categorization positions the individual I within the group or groups that define the collective we. There is thus an intimate link between our self-concept as defined by specific attributes, the personal individual I, and our self-concepts as defined by group membership, the social collective we. It then follows that these self-portraits reveal a great deal about the dynamics between the artist's conception of the individual self and their collective self. At the most basic level, all these works attest to the socially constructed nature of self-portrait as a representation of the self-concept. For instance, these paintings on the left were painted with the intention of being as every inch as self-expressive as the oil paintings on the right. But an expression of the self-concept in Nihonga, literally meaning Japanese painting, but which is modern Japanese painting made with East Asian media, did not privilege the mimetic representation of one's face or physical likeness. As a result, representative Nihonga works from this period do not include a single self-portrait. In other words, the very act of painting one's own portrait already signaled one's group identity as a Western style, as opposed to Japanese style artist. It is only within this collective we that a more specific characterization of the individual I can be defined. In order to understand the historical condition that gave rise to the formation of art groups, we also need a bigger picture of the art world in Japan at the time. This is a schematic diagram, although I apologize, it still looks quite confusing. For those who wanted to make a living as fine artists, the summit of prestige was the annual juried Ministry of Education Fine Arts Exhibition, commonly known as bunten in Japanese. Some of the art groups were formed in explicit defiance against the bunten, such as the Nikakai or the Second Section Society, or in complete dismissal, such as the more explicitly avant-garde groups that came later, like MAVO. While others, and even those that initially began in opposition, including Nikakai, came to function as alternative but not necessarily antagonistic venues to show their works that could be included at the bunten, that could not be included at the bunten. There existed a complex symbiosis between the state-sanctioned authority of the bunten and these art groups, a few large and established and still in existence, while most others were small and short-lived. Some split off, reconfigured, and regrouped. Japan at this time also did not have powerful art dealers who brokered the career of individual artists. Therefore, for many artists, becoming a part of these self-managed art groups and participating in their group exhibitions were critical and often the only way to show their work to get public attention. By the way, one of the initial questions that I was asked was, why were there so many art groups in Japan? This is indeed an important question, and one which has not yet been addressed explicitly as a critical issue in the study of modern Japanese art. My preliminary response is that these small and medium-sized groups were everywhere to be found in Japanese society, not just groups of professional artists, but amateur art societies, photography clubs, poetry circles, fan clubs, alumni associations, business leaders, political groups, etc. In other words, the existence of groups were reflective of the general pattern of socialization and networking in modern Japan. Furthermore, refined culture pursuits, such as linked poetry and tea ceremony, historically developed as social activities So there existed a long-standing practice of engaging in creative acts and aesthetic evaluation collectively. These factors may have led scholars of Japan to overlook the significance of art groups in the modern period because their ubiquity has somewhat been taken for granted. As you can see in these photographs, a common characteristic of these groups was that, broadly speaking, they were homogeneous, homosocial communities, associations of young Japanese men who shared an artistic vision. Groups tended to start small. For example, the Kokuga Sosaku Kyokai, or the Society of the Creation of Japanese Painting, established in Kyoto and shown in the middle, began with 5 members only. Social ties in these groups were moreover not rigidly hierarchical and more fraternal and personal. It was common, for instance, for the core members to have been trained at the same art school of studio, or having studied or traveled together abroad. None of the major art groups from this period had a female member in a leading role. There were female artists in close proximity, such as Takamura Kotaro's wife Chieko, a trained oil painter, but they were not included, even if they played an important role in the family and romantic life of the male members. These young male artists were moreover interested in acquiring a cosmopolitan outlook and eager to establish an international network. The group typically had 1 or more members who had studied in major European and American cities, and these returnees to Japan, or kichosha, as they were called in Japanese, functioned as important nodes in the global network of modernist artists and connected Japan to cultural centers outside. As I mentioned earlier, the 1914 exhibit of Der Sturm was enabled by the Berlin connection that was brought by Yamada and Saito, who had studied there. Long-term and temporary visitors from Europe also had a sympathetic host in these groups. The English artist Bernard Leach, born in Hong Kong, raised partly in Japan, and trained as a print artist in London, was close to the members of the Shirakaba circle, as you can see in the photo, and it was famously in Japan that he turned to pottery. In 1920, when the Ukrainian artists David Berluk and Viktor Palmov arrived in Japan for an extended stay that lasted for almost 2 years, it was the painters associated with Nikakai, such as Ishii Hakute and Togo Seiji, whom they first approached to discuss how their art could be disseminated in Japan. Of course, Berluk and his brother knew Kandinsky and had participated in the Blue Rider exhibit earlier, though by this time he was known as a leader of Russian Futurism. After Japan, he went to the US, so these international connections were not just bilateral between Japan and the country of their origin, but often more global. Now, a major characteristic of self-expression that was collectively conceived during this period was a tendency to approach artistic creativity as an integral, primal element in the flow of life that was idiosyncratic to each individual, but was also somehow capable of transcending beyond to the collective, whether immediately more local or for some more spiritually inclined, such as the case with Yanagi on the left, who was interested in Swedenborgian mysticism, the universal. An influential approach was proposed by Takamura Kotaro, son of a prominent sculptor and a trained sculptor and painter himself. In April 1910 issue of the literary magazine Subaru, he published an essay titled A Green Sun, Midori-iro no Taiyo. In it, he declared, "I seek absolute Freiheit, freedom, in the art world. In every sense, I like to think of the artist as a single human being. I like to place one work above or below another on the basis of the amount of das Leben, life. I like to allow the Persönlichkeit, personality of the artist, who has painted a green sun, to have absolute authority. And I like him to express on his canvas the tone of nature as he sees it, freely, indulgently, willfully." Takamura used German terms to promote his cosmopolitan identity and to project a sense of transcultural validity to his thought, having recently returned to Japan after a study in New York, London, and Paris. From the perspective of group dynamics, it is significant that he wrote this piece in the context of an ongoing debate whether Japanese artists should self-consciously produce a sense of local color in their work to show one's Japaneseness. Takamura's response was a bit circular. He basically said that since we are Japanese, in quote, no matter what willful things we may do, all we'll have left after our death will be works only Japanese can make, end quote. In a sense, though, I think he intuitively understood the group dynamics between the I and the we, that the individual self can never be expressed outside the group dynamics that shapes it in relation to the collective. The literary scholar Suzuki Sadami has coined the term Taisho vitalism, Taisho seimei shugi, to describe the widespread cultural, philosophical, spiritual, and scientific interest in the invisible force or energy that animates life in early 20th century Japan. It is labeled Taisho because the period roughly coincided with the reign of the Taisho emperor from 1912 to 1926. But as Suzuki's study makes it clear, vitalism, broadly defined as an interest in non-rational principle that animates life, was an international and transcultural movement involving the thought of figures as diverse as Nietzsche, Bergson, Tolstoy, Kropotkin, and William James. Artistic modernism was an important manifestation of this widespread movement. On the screen are the covers of the first and a later issue of the literary magazine Shirakaba, or White Birch, which played an important role in formulating this new life-centered and self-focused idea of artistic creativity. Many things can be said about this group, and you also see that Takamura Kotaro was a member. But here, I simply call your attention to the image of a young and erect freestanding tree as the collective self-image of the group. It symbolizes organic growth that is at once unique and one of a kind, and yet rooted in the soil that integrated into the natural environment that nurtures it. In fact, it turns out that more than one names of the art groups from the period similarly evoked the image of regenerative nature and plant growth, such as Sodosha, the grass and soil or dirt society, Kofukai, light and wind society, Shun-yokai, spring sun society, even Zasosha, weed society. Names of the more overtly avant-garde art groups formed in the early 1920s are significantly different: Action, MAVO, Plastic Arts, Zoukei, etc. We must recognize, of course, that this idealization of nature and life that is organic and spiritually enchanted was a characteristic modern preoccupation. Its appeal was intensified in reaction to industrialization. But it was the modern print media and the development in print industry that enabled these ideas and images to be circulated widely. Group exhibitions were temporary affairs with a limited audience. However, even if these journals didn't have a huge subscription base, by publishing original works, photographic reproductions, along with art criticism, reviews, manifestos, etc., they, as physical printed matter and existent in multiples, offered a more accessible, extensive, sustained, and malleable forum of communication among those who collectively contributed to the production, and also between the reader and the contributors, and between the readers. Printed matter as a collaborative intermediate integrates word and image. During this period, aside from periodicals, many books were produced as a result of collaboration between the publisher, the writer, and the visual artist. Taken as a text, a book is a sole product of its author, of course, but as a physical object, a book has a material and visual dimension in addition to offering a textual space, as you can see in this striking example here. I'd like to end this presentation by discussing the woodblock prints by Onchi Koshiro as works that are at once personal and abstract, and were created in a collaborative context and out of cross-cultural and cross-media inspirations. As such, they exemplify the idea of individual self-expression in the age of groups. The woodblock print journal, titled Tsukuhae, Moonlight or Moonglow, was a small operation of 3 students at the Tokyo School of Fine Arts, Onchi Koshiro, Tanaka Kyokichi, and Fujimori Shizuo. The artists designed, carved the woodblocks, and pigmented and printed them on paper themselves. This one-person process was unlike the traditional workshop production for which early modern Japan was world famous, but found kindred spirits in the modern print movement popularized by artists such as Arthur Wesley Dow in the US, who actually studied Japanese prints extensively. In Japan, the art print movement led to the establishment of the Japan Creative Print Association, Nihon Sōsaku Hanga Kyokai, in 1918, which was the first association of print artists in Japan. Onchi and Fujimori were among the first founding members. These are among the first prints that Onchi began calling JoJo or lyric. This one in the center, titled Akarui Toki, Clear Bright Hours, is known as one of the first abstract works in modern Japanese art. And it is interesting how the media that enabled it was a woodblock print and not a painting. Kandinsky's prints were certainly among Onchi's sources of inspiration. His lifelong friendship with the composer Yamada, an organizer of the 1914 Dear Student print exhibit, also began around this time. Clear Hours is abstract in that we cannot find or identify any representational shapes, but it nonetheless appeals to our desire to project an image of some kind consisting of round, vibrant parts, and we can also feel a moderate tempo of concentric movement towards the center, an opening that suggests spatial depth, and is represented by the blank white surface of the paper. It looks like a rose in reverse. Drawings from this period also reveal a more sexual association. The print on the left, titled I Still Have Hope, indicates that Onchi's abstraction at this point retained a connection to simplified representational motifs like the eye, as seen in the bottom right. And even in more abstract works, such as Hearts Believing Each Other on the right. The viewer is invited to reflect on the relationship between the image and the title, which provides an evocative picture instead of a purely abstract concept. The correspondence between word and image to achieve poetic expression is something that the magazine Tsukuhae pursued collectively as it published poems in addition to prints. Onchi and his friends moreover admired the work of Takehisa Yumeji, who worked outside the Bunten system that I explained earlier. Yumeji was a star illustrator in the commercial publishing industry, creating many works for magazines that especially targeted children and young women. He also published illustrated prose poem books, which enjoyed a wide readership. The intermediate fluidity between text and image in Yumeji's work attracted Onchi and other young artists who gathered around him at the time. Reference to music was also internalized in Onchi's lyric series, starting with the series title Lyric. The origin of lyric poetry goes back to ancient Greece and the genre of sung verses accompanied by a musical instrument. When this European literary genre was introduced to Japan in the late 19th century, the neologism chosen was jojo, literally meaning describing emotions or sentiments. Lyric poetry's emphasis on personal emotions was compatible with the existing poetic tradition in Japan, and as a result, jojoshi or lyric poetry became a popular genre in modern Japanese poetry. Onchi's prints synthesized the visual, with JoJo's literary connotation and its musical association. In 1918, he categorized his work that sought to give form to the artist's inner subjective emotions, junjojoga, or pure lyric pictures, in contrast to what he called shinshoga, or mental image picture, which are images that gave shape to the artist's emotions, caused in relation to external things. Many modernist artists, including Kandinsky, believe that different media were complementary means to express the artist's inner emotion. Within East Asia, equivalence between poetry and painting also hold a century-old canonical status since the Song dynasty in the literati theory of Suzhou, who famously wrote, in quote, "When one savors Wang Wei's poems, there are paintings in them. When one looks at Wang Wei's pictures, they are poems. Du Hu's writings are pictures without forms. Han Kan's paintings, unspoken poems." End quote. To conclude, these prints by Onchi can thus be taken as expressions or externalization of the artist's inner emotions, but the concrete form in which they became communicable as artworks shows how he positioned his work in relation to cultural practices and traditions that developed collectively. And most importantly, these distinctive works were produced and circulated in a collaborative environment, wherein he worked alongside his fellow artists, composing in groups as I titled my talk. Thank you for listening.